New York sold itself as different. No burning crosses in town squares. No bodies swinging from oak trees in daylight. No mobs posing for photographs. That was the lie, because racial terror doesn't require spectacle. It only needs permission. And in New York City, that permission came quietly, from locked precinct doors, stalled investigations, lost evidence, and officers who knew exactly when not to look. At the start of the 20th century, New York was exploding. Millions arrived. Industry roared. Harlem became the capital of Black America. Loud, creative, defiant. But beneath the jazz clubs and brownstones, something else was organizing. White supremacy didn't vanish when it crossed the Mason-Dixon line. It adapted. By the 1910s and 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had active chapters across New York State, including the city and its surrounding counties. Membership drives were public. Rallies were legal. Politicians attended. Newspapers reported it as controversy, not danger. The Klan didn't always lynch in New York. They threatened. They assaulted. They disappeared people socially, economically, and legally. And when violence did occur, it often arrived stripped of ceremony. A beating in an alley, a stabbing outside a bar, a body found with no urgency attached. Harlem residents learned early that justice moved differently depending on who was bleeding. Police patrols were heavy, but protection was light. Black neighborhoods were over-policed and under-defended at the same time. Every interaction carried tension. Every complaint risked retaliation. By mid-century, that tension had hardened into pattern. White attackers who crossed into Harlem rarely faced the same pursuit as black suspects who crossed out. Witnesses were ignored. Statements were rewritten. Timelines blurred. Files stayed open just long enough to close themselves. Then came the breaking points. In 1964, Harlem erupted after the police killing of a black teenager. Official statements collapsed under eyewitness testimony. The city promised reform. The anger never left. Less than a decade later, in 1973, Clifford Glover, a 10-year-old boy, was shot and killed by a white plainclothes officer in Queens. The officer claimed fear. The gun was barely visible. The boy was running away. The city tried to bury it as procedure. The streets answered back. Protests spread. Harlem remembered every ignored beating, every delayed investigation, every silent precinct hallway. The message was clear. This wasn't one bad cop. It was an architecture, and that architecture had existed long before. During the Klan's peak influence in the 1920s, New York authorities tracked membership numbers, but rarely disrupted them. Surveillance existed. Action didn't. The Klan didn't need secrecy when it knew the system would treat its violence as background noise. That legacy carried forward. By the time organized crime figures and street gangs rose to prominence in Harlem, residents already understood one rule: the law was selective. Protection was conditional. Justice was negotiable. And violence against black bodies could vanish into paperwork. This wasn't Southern-style lynching. It was Northern erasure. No ropes, no crowds, just the quiet understanding that some deaths didn't require urgency. By the late 20th century, the Klan's public presence faded, but its impact didn't. White supremacist violence splintered into lone actors, small cells, and anonymous attacks. Police failures continued, sometimes through bias, sometimes through fear of scandal, sometimes through indifference. What made New York dangerous wasn't chaos. It was order. An order that looked clean from the outside. An order that wore uniforms. An order that knew how to stall until the streets forgot. Harlem never forgot, and the city never fully answered for what it allowed to happen. This chapter isn't about one murder. It's about a system that learned how to let violence breathe, quietly, efficiently, and without fingerprints. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to name the patterns. The people. The consequences. Because monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they file reports. New York never needed white hoods to protect white supremacy. It had precinct walls. It had internal memos. It had pending investigation. By the time Harlem became the symbolic capital of Black America, the system surrounding it was already calibrated. The violence wasn't always public. It wasn't always organized, but it was always absorbed. and absorption is protection. The Ku Klux Klan's visible presence in New York peaked in the 1920s. They recruited openly in upstate towns. They marched in parts of Long Island. They held meetings in rented halls. Membership lists included businessmen, municipal employees, and men who wore uniforms during the day. What matters isn't that they burned crosses in Manhattan. What matters is that they didn't have to. Because white supremacist ideology doesn't require robes when it already lives inside hiring patterns, patrol assignments, and courtroom discretion. The architecture hardened in silence. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Black residents in Harlem filed complaints about beatings, harassment, and selective arrests. The pattern was mechanical. A Black victim reports assault. Officers take notes. Witnesses are dismissed as unreliable. Charges are downgraded. Paperwork slows. Case fades. Repeat. Meanwhile, when white suspects crossed into Black neighborhoods to intimidate, vandalize, or assault, patrol response times were different. Questioning was softer. Pursuit was slower. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And by mid-century, that choreography was institutional. The New York City Police Department had grown into one of the most powerful police forces in the world. Its size was unmatched. Its influence was political. Its image was national. But inside Harlem, its relationship with residents was transactional at best, adversarial at worst. Policing wasn't protection. It was containment. In the 1960s, civil rights unrest didn't erupt in Harlem because the South was violent. It erupted because Northern hypocrisy was louder. When officers killed or brutalized Black residents, official narratives moved fast. Internal reviews moved slow. Statements were crafted before facts were examined. The 1964 Harlem Uprising wasn't spontaneous. It followed the police killing of 15-year-old James Powell. Officers claimed self-defense. Witnesses described excessive force. The city tried to frame it as disorder. But Harlem understood it as confirmation. Then in 1973, 10-year-old Clifford Glover was shot in Queens by a white plainclothes officer. The boy was unarmed. He was running. The officer claimed he believed the child was armed. He wasn't. The trial ended in acquittal. The streets ignited again. What does that have to do with white supremacist violence? Everything. Because terror isn't only about mobs. It's about credibility. When the state repeatedly refuses to punish violence against a specific community, it sends a message, not just to victims, but to perpetrators. You will not be pursued with urgency. That message is oxygen. During the 1970s and 1980s, white supremacist groups in the Northeast fractured into smaller cells. They weren't marching anymore. They were operating through intimidation, vandalism, beatings, and sporadic murders. Some were linked to larger networks. Others were lone actors radicalized by ideology that never left. When attacks occurred, especially in outer boroughs or nearby counties, investigations were inconsistent. Hate crime classifications were rare. Motives were diluted. Records were poorly preserved. It wasn't always conspiracy. Sometimes it was something more dangerous, institutional fatigue. When violence becomes expected in certain zip codes, it stops triggering urgency. Harlem, the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn, they were treated as self-contained ecosystems. Violence that was framed as internal. When outside actors entered to destabilize or exploit, it blurred into the background. And background violence doesn't mobilize departments. It files itself. Inside precinct culture, loyalty was inward. Whistleblowers were rare. Officers who challenged bias risked isolation. Promotions favored quiet compliance. You didn't have to be in the Klan to maintain its impact. You just had to look away at the right moment. The result wasn't cinematic terror. It was administrative suffocation. Victims faced a wall of procedure. Families encountered silence. Records were sealed. Complaints disappeared into review boards that rarely disciplined aggressively. Meanwhile, Harlem evolved its own systems of defense. Community patrols formed. Local leaders organized neighborhood watches. Street figures, some criminal, some protective, gained influence by offering what official structures did not: response. And when organized crime figures rose in Harlem, including those who became infamous nationally, they operated in a city that had already taught its residents something essential. The badge is not neutral. That distrust wasn't manufactured. It was earned. White supremacist ideology didn't need mass rallies in Harlem to survive. It survived through uneven enforcement, through selective empathy, through prosecutorial discretion that weighed victims differently depending on their address. By the 1980s, the public face of the Klan had diminished in New York City. But white supremacist violence hadn't disappeared. It rebranded. It decentralized. It integrated into other extremist movements. An institutional response remained reactive, not preventative, because prevention requires acknowledgement. An acknowledgement would require admitting something the city never wanted to say out loud. New York was not immune. It had simply refined the method. Where the South displayed its terror, New York archived it. Where mobs made noise, bureaucracies made delay. Where ropes swung publicly, files closed quietly. The people involved in this system weren't caricatures. They weren't cartoon villains. They were supervisors, officers, clerks, prosecutors, individuals who operated within structures that rewarded inertia and punished disruption. And in that environment, white supremacist violence didn't need headlines. It needed time. Time to stall investigations. Time to erode trust. Time to signal safety to those willing to act on hate. By the end of the 20th century, oversight boards, federal scrutiny, and public pressure forced reforms. But reforms don't erase culture overnight. They paper over it. The legacy remained visible in clearance rates, sentencing disparities, and community mistrust that spanned generations. Harlem didn't explode randomly in the 1960s and 70s. It reacted to a system that had quietly told it for decades. You were protected differently. And in that difference, white supremacist violence found shelter. Chapter 3 is where the pattern turns concrete, where we move from structure to blood. Because institutions don't just fail in theory. They fail in moments. And those moments leave bodies. Systems fail quietly, but sometimes they fail in public. And when they do, the blood forces the paperwork into daylight. By the mid-1980s, the architecture we've exposed, the delayed responses, the downgraded charges, the softened classifications, stopped looking abstract. It started producing names. Howard Beach, 1986. A black man named Michael Griffith and two friends drove into Howard Beach, Queens, after their car broke down. They were chased by a group of white residents armed with bats and sticks. The pursuit was not subtle. It was not isolated. It was loud. Griffith ran onto a highway, trying to escape. He was struck and killed by a passing vehicle. The attackers claimed they were protecting their neighborhood. Police response was immediate, but classification wasn't. Initial framing treated the violence as local disorder, not racial terror, not coordinated intimidation, not supremacist ideology. Protests erupted across New York. Residents demanded hate crime recognition. They demanded federal oversight. They demanded something Harlem had been asking for decades: equal urgency. Eventually, convictions came, but only after public pressure forced momentum. Without cameras, without outrage, without headlines, would have moved? That question never left. Bensonhurst, 1989. 3 years later, history repeated itself. Yusuf Hawkins, a 16-year-old black teenager, traveled to Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, to inquire about a used car. He never got the chance. A white mob surrounded him. Someone fired a gun. Hawkins died in the street. Witnesses described racial slurs, organized hostility, neighborhood coordination. It wasn't spontaneous rage. It was territorial enforcement. Again, outrage forced movement. Civil rights leaders marched through Bensonhurst under police escort. Tension crackled. Residents screamed from sidewalks. The city's racial fracture lines were no longer contained in Harlem. They were exposed borough-wide. Trials resulted in convictions. But what haunted residents wasn't only the shooting. It was the speed of earlier inaction. Warnings had existed. Racial intimidation in the neighborhood wasn't new. Police presence had not prevented escalation. and classification of hate-driven violence still required public pressure. The pattern was visible now. Violence erupts. Initial minimization. Community outrage. Delayed acknowledgement. Forced prosecution. Repeat. Institutional hesitation. By the late 1980s, the FBI had increased monitoring of extremist groups nationwide. The Federal Bureau of Investigation tracked white supremacist activity across multiple states, including the Northeast. Intelligence reports acknowledged splinter groups, decentralized networks, and ideologically motivated lone actors. But intelligence isn't prevention, and local enforcement determines response speed. New York prided itself on sophistication. It wasn't Mississippi. It wasn't Alabama. But sophistication doesn't eliminate bias. It refines it. In several racially charged attacks throughout the 80s and early 90s, community leaders criticized local police for slow hate crime designations. Motives were labeled disputes. Racial slurs were treated as emotional context, not evidence of ideology. Classification determines resources. Resources determine momentum. Momentum determines justice. And hesitation sends a signal. Crown Heights, 1991. Tension between Black and Jewish residents in Crown Heights had simmered for years. When a car in a Hasidic motorcade struck and killed a Black child, rumors spread rapidly. Anger ignited. Riots followed. In the chaos, a Jewish student, Yankel Rosenbaum, was stabbed and killed. The violence exposed something deeper than neighborhood conflict. It exposed institutional fragility. Police struggled to contain unrest. Trust collapsed on all sides. Narratives hardened instantly. What mattered was this: communities already believed the system would not treat them fairly. That belief had been built over decades. And when belief collapses, rumor moves faster than law. The psychology of impunity. White supremacist violence in New York never looked like synchronized marches through Manhattan. It looked like neighborhoods that felt emboldened. It looked like individuals who believed the response would be slow. It looked like hate speech escalating into coordinated assault. The perpetrators in these cases were not robed Klansmen from rural backroads. They were locals, teenagers, construction workers, residents who believed territory justified force. Where does that belief come from? From history. From decades where Black neighborhoods were over-policed for minor infractions, but underprotected from targeted hostility. From moments where investigations stalled unless cameras arrived. From trials that required marches before they moved. Impunity is cumulative. It grows each time justice hesitates. Media versus reality. By the 1990s, national media began covering racial violence in New York more aggressively. The city's image, global, progressive, culturally dominant, clashed with footage of mobs screaming slurs. That contrast created pressure. Pressure created prosecutions. But systemic repair moves slower than headlines. Oversight boards were strengthened. Civil rights lawsuits expanded. Internal affairs investigations increased. Yet mistrust remained embedded. Because for every high-profile case that reached conviction, there were quieter ones that didn't. Beatings misclassified. Threats undocumented. Patterns dismissed as coincidence. And in that quiet space, extremist ideology survived. Not in mass rallies. In belief systems. The cost. Michael Griffith's death. Yusuf Hawkins' death. The Crown Heights unrest. These weren't Southern reenactments. They were Northern exposures. They revealed that racial terror adapts to geography. It doesn't need trees. It needs delay. It needs hesitation. It needs communities that feel unprotected long enough for resentment to calcify. New York eventually prosecuted, eventually convicted, eventually acknowledged racial motive. But the word eventually is the indictment. Because justice delayed reshapes behavior. Communities organize differently. Neighborhoods harden. Street figures rise to fill perceived gaps. Trust erodes generationally. And once trust collapses, policing becomes occupation. That psychological shift, not just the violence, is the legacy. Chapter 4 moves into consequences. The federal oversight. The lawsuits. The reforms forced by exposure. Because systems don't collapse overnight. They fracture under pressure. And by the 1990s, the pressure was national. Pressure didn't come from within. It came from the streets. By the early 1990s, New York City was no longer able to contain racial violence inside borough lines. The deaths of Michael Griffith, Yusuf Hawkins, the unrest in Crown Heights. Each incident peeled back the same layer. The system moved, but only when pushed. And pushback had become constant. Civil rights attorneys began filing federal lawsuits, targeting patterns, not just cases. They argued selective enforcement, unequal classification of hate crimes, discriminatory policing, improper investigations. Individual trials were no longer the only battlefield. Policy was. Community coalitions demanded independent review boards with teeth. They demanded transparency in disciplinary records. They demanded hate crime tracking that didn't require protests to activate. The federal government began watching more closely. The U.S. Department of Justice increased civil rights oversight nationwide during the 1990s, particularly in cities facing repeated racial unrest. Pattern or practice investigations became a tool, a way to examine systems rather than isolated officers. New York resisted the implication that it required outside supervision. But resistance didn't erase evidence. Statistical disparities surfaced. Stop and frisk data would later reveal disproportionate targeting. Clearance rates in racially charged cases were scrutinized. Community trust surveys painted a bleak picture. Reform became unavoidable. The Civilian Complaint Review Board expanded its authority. Public reporting increased. Internal affairs divisions faced greater scrutiny. Training programs were revised to include bias recognition and hate crime protocol. But reform is structural. Culture is behavioral. And culture doesn't shift because a memo says so. Within the New York City Police Department, tension brewed. Some officers felt targeted. Others acknowledged past failures quietly. Whistleblowers remained rare. Loyalty remained internal. Externally, communities remained cautious. Harlem did not celebrate oversight. It waited to see if it would matter. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, hate crime legislation strengthened at state and federal levels. Prosecutors became more willing to apply enhanced penalties. Public rhetoric shifted. Open white supremacist organizing declined in visibility. But ideology doesn't disappear because it becomes unfashionable. It migrates. White supremacist violence moved further underground. It embedded itself in smaller networks, prison radicalization circles, online forums as the internet matured. New York adapted too. Specialized hate crime task forces formed. Data collection improved. Media pressure ensured faster classification in high-profile cases. The gap between outrage and response shortened, but never fully closed, because every reform carried memory. Michael Griffith's name lingered in Queens. Yusuf Hawkins' name lingered in Brooklyn. Crown Heights lingered in collective consciousness. The lesson was not that New York was uniquely violent. It was that New York was uniquely capable of denial. The collapse wasn't dramatic. There was no singular scandal that shattered the system. Instead, it fractured under cumulative exposure. Each protest chipped away at credibility. Each lawsuit forced disclosure. Each federal inquiry added weight. By the 2000s, institutional language had changed. Officers spoke of community policing. Hate crime units responded more visibly. Public relations improved. But reform under pressure creates compliance. Trust requires time, and trust had been eroded for generations. The deeper consequence wasn't just policy change. It was psychological. Black communities in Harlem and beyond had learned to self-monitor, to film interactions, to assume delay, to anticipate skepticism. Police officers had learned to operate under scrutiny, sometimes defensively, sometimes resentfully. The relationship shifted from neglect to tension. Not harmony, not resolution, just tension. And tension is volatile, because unresolved history doesn't disappear. It resurfaces under stress, in moments of crisis, in political shifts, in new waves of extremism. The 1980s and early 1990s forced New York to acknowledge racial violence publicly. They forced prosecutions. They forced oversight. But they didn't erase the architecture that allowed hesitation in the first place. They exposed it. And exposure changes behavior, even if it doesn't change belief. Chapter 5 is about that belief, about the long-term psychological fallout, about how communities internalize systemic delay, and about how institutions carry scars they rarely admit to having. Because reform isn't redemption, it's survival.